The courtroom air hung heavy, not from heat, but from something older. The faint chemical sting of floor wax mingled with the paper-dry scent of case files and the low, buzzing hum of aging fluorescent lights. Everything felt dim, muted, like justice itself had been worn thin from overuse and undercare. Wooden benches lined the room, their edges smoothed not by design, but by restless hands and shifting weight. A half-hearted whisper here, a cough there, the noise of people not really paying attention, only waiting for the next routine humiliation. Then the doors creaked open. He stepped inside. James T. Rowland, tall, thin, shoulders slightly stooped but not in submission. His coat hung like a ragged banner around him, threadbare at the elbows, frayed along the hem. Boots dulled with dust. A knit-cap tugged low, almost shielding his eyes, but not quite. His gaze scanned the room, sharp, observant, sober. Not angry. Not afraid. Just tired. And watchful. The room responded before the judge could. Whispers surged through the benches like a ripple across stagnant water. Homeless? Is he lost? He's in the wrong place, poor thing. A smirk here. A glance there. One man in a charcoal suit tilted his head and murmured, "We really letting vagrants wander in now?" James said nothing. He moved slowly down the aisle, each footstep soft but deliberate, like he'd walked this kind of path before, past judgment, over pity, under stares. The bailiff glanced toward the bench and nodded slightly. That was enough. James stopped at the defendant's table and rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair, but he didn't sit. He stood tall, like someone who had decided that sitting would somehow give up more than just height. On the bench above him, Judge Ronald Kearns didn't look up immediately. White-haired, sun-spotted hands flipping through the docket, half-glasses perched low on his nose, he carried the aura of a man who'd long ago stopped being surprised or caring. When he finally glanced up, it wasn't curiosity that filled his eyes. It was impatience wrapped in superiority. "Well," Kearns said slowly, dragging the word like a foot through sand, "Mr. Rowland, is it?" James nodded once. The judge tilted his head, studying him like a specimen that had landed on the wrong tray. He gave a half-smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Do you have counsel, or is this going to be one of those noble, dramatic self-representation things?" Laughter flickered in the gallery, not loud, not cruel, but sharp enough. Someone exhaled hard through their nose. A woman leaned over and whispered, "Does he even know what court this is?" James's mouth didn't move. Not yet. Internally, the moment sat like a slow burn. He had known it would come. He'd worn the coat knowing it. Felt every fray in the fabric as a prelude to dismissal. Seen these eyes before, in subways, in job interviews, in church basements handing out soup. They never said it outright. They didn't need to. Black. Homeless. Alone. Therefore, irrelevant. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he said finally. The judge blinked as if caught off guard by the calm clarity of the response. Then he smirked again, tapping the gavel gently on the bench as if that gave him back control. "Of course you will," Kearns said, voice dry as dust. "Because that always ends well." He leaned back, chair creaking beneath him. The courtroom had settled into its assumption this was going to be another routine case, another man chewed up by the system and spit out into paperwork. James didn't move. He wasn't performing. He didn't raise his voice or puff out his chest. He simply stood, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady on the judge. And in that quiet, something cracked, not in sound, but in presence. The judge glanced down again at his docket. "Charged with violation of City Code 14.07.3b, he recited. "Presence in city parks after curfew. Do you understand the charge?" "I do," James replied. Kearns looked back up, eyebrow raised. "And you still don't want a public defender?" "No, Your Honor." "Right," the judge muttered. Then, louder, "Well, let's get through this quickly. I've got a full docket today." James took a small step forward, hand brushing the worn lectern. "I would like to address the charge directly, Your Honor." Something in his tone made the judge pause. Just a beat too long. The gallery shifted, subtle, collective. Some leaned forward. Others narrowed their eyes. The script wasn't going quite as expected. Kearns gave a slow, sarcastic nod. "By all means, Mr. Rowland. Dazzle us." James opened his mouth to speak, but didn't. Not yet. Instead, he slid a single, folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it on the table in front of him, his fingers brushing over it like it meant something. His eyes met the judge's. Steady. Unblinking. And then he spoke. But not with volume. With precision. With the weight of someone who had waited for this moment not for minutes, but for years. Before addressing the charge, he began, "I request the court take judicial notice of Section 2 of the City Charter concerning the obligation to consider shelter availability when enforcing public space ordinances." And in that moment, something shifted. The judge didn't interrupt. The audience didn't laugh. Because suddenly they realized. He wasn't here to play a role. He was here to rewrite the scene. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." James's voice was clear, measured. It didn't rise or strain for importance, it didn't need to. The calm in it felt deliberate, like a blade being unsheathed slowly. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the air. Then came the laughter. Not loud, not chaotic, just sharp enough to wound. A few chuckles scattered across the courtroom like pebbles skipping over still water. Someone exhaled through their nose a little too hard. Another leaned sideways to whisper something behind a cupped hand. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated before resuming their clack against the keys. Judge Kearns reclined in his leather chair, the aged material creaking like dry bark. He smiled, that same smile, wide and smug, as if the entire court was his audience and James had just delivered the setup to a perfect joke. "Oh, this is going to be fun," the judge drawled, tapping the side of his gavel with lazy amusement. "Well, I hope you've at least read the statute, Mr. Rowland. That's generally where we like to begin around here." More chuckles. One man in the back row laughed a little louder than necessary, then glanced around to make sure others noticed. A woman in a navy blouse rolled her eyes and mouthed something to the person beside her. James didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. He'd heard them before. He had lived this moment before. Years ago, a classroom bright with fluorescent lights and cold authority. A professor, sharp-voiced and dismissive, had asked why the janitor was sitting in the front row. Then again, a job interview downtown, shiny offices and suits that smiled too wide. A partner glanced at James's resume and asked if he'd thought about working in community outreach instead. And again, the night he lost his apartment. The officer didn't yell. He just looked James over, shrugged, and muttered, "You people always end up here anyway." Now here he was again. Back in the same posture. Under the same eyes. James stood still, both hands resting lightly on the defendant's table, fingers unfurled. His coat sagged off one shoulder, the collar still half-folded from wind or wear. His boots, scuffed at the toes, barely moved. He didn't blink. Didn't frown. Didn't flinch. He was a statue carved from patience. "I'm confident in my ability to respond to the charges," he repeated, this time more softly. Not a protest. Not a plea. Just fact. Kearns waved one dismissive hand in the air as if shooing a gnat. "Sure you are. Let's keep the circus moving." From the gallery, someone muttered, "Delusional." Another replied, "Embarrassing." And still, James did not react. He couldn't afford to. He'd learned the hard way that dignity, when provoked, could look like defiance. That raised voices turned into contempt in the judge's notes. That anger, even justified, could cost you everything when you wore skin like his. So instead, he breathed. Slowly. Deeply. He let them laugh. Let them enjoy the performance they thought they were watching. Because James wasn't there to perform. He was there to document. To let the system trap itself in its own ridicule. To let every smirk, every joke, every eye roll write itself into the court record like ink staining the margin of justice. "Let the court note," he said, speaking as if delivering a motion, because he was, "that I am invoking my Sixth Amendment right to self-representation. I will proceed without a public defender." That made the judge sit up just slightly. Not much, but enough. The smirk didn't disappear, but it flickered. Just a crack. "You ever even been in a courtroom before?" Kearns asked. James met his gaze. Once or twice. A few more laughs, this time with the tremor of uncertainty beneath them. James could feel it shifting now, the mood, the temperature. They were still laughing, but not as freely. Not as confidently. The certainty was slipping. He opened the folder he had brought. Just one. Thin, battered, held together with a rubber band. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, its edges worn from careful handling. He didn't hold it up. Didn't announce it. He just laid it gently on the table. Waiting. Let them laugh now. Because when it stopped, it would stop all at once, like a string pulled taut finally snapping. And when it did, it would not just be quiet. It would be reverent. The courtroom was still, not the stillness of reverence, but of expectation. Of a crowd waiting for a train wreck they could already hear coming. James stood behind the lectern, both hands resting lightly on its worn edges. The wood beneath his fingertips was etched with decades of defense, fingernail grooves, pressure marks, ink smudges that had never quite come clean. A place where stories were told, forgotten, buried. He inhaled slowly. The courtroom watched, not out of respect but with the quiet indulgence of those waiting for a man to embarrass himself. The judge adjusted his robe with a theatrical sigh. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Rowland." James raised his eyes, met the judge's, and began calm, unwavering. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss the charges under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as interpreted in Papakrista v. City of Jacksonville, 405 U.S. 156. The silence that followed was not polite. It was stunned. A few heads in the gallery turned. A pencil dropped and clattered against the floor. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed, then stopped abruptly as if afraid to break the moment. Judge Kearns blinked. James continued, unfazed. In Papachristou, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that vague and arbitrary vagrancy laws often used to target the poor and marginalized violated the Constitution by failing to provide clear standards and encouraging discriminatory enforcement. He flipped a single page in his notepad, no theatrics, no urgency. Just controlled movement, deliberate. My presence in the park, while homeless and lacking access to shelter, aligns precisely with the kind of circumstance the court sought to protect. This city's ordinance is, by nature and in execution, a violation of the protections set forth in that ruling. The courtroom was silent now in a new way. This wasn't waiting for failure. This was watching something shift. Judge Kearns sat straighter. The smile that had hovered on his face minutes earlier had thinned, drawn into a taut line. His fingers tapped once, then stopped. James pressed forward. Furthermore, he said, lifting his eyes toward the bench, I draw the court's attention to Martin v. City of Boise, 9th Circuit, 920 F.3 D. 584, where the court held that criminalizing the act of sleeping in public spaces when no shelter was available constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each word dropped like a stone in still water, causing subtle ripples that reached further than most realized. Newbridge, James said, emphasizing the city name, currently reports insufficient shelter space during winter months. Therefore, enforcement of Municipal Code 14.07.3b under these conditions is unconstitutional. Kearns swallowed once, audibly. James watched the shift. The gallery was no longer chuckling. They were leaning in now, blinking slower, trying to reconcile the image of the man in worn boots with the voice that sounded like it belonged behind a different bench altogether. The judge opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. James didn't give him the chance. And, he added, with the steady tone of someone setting the final piece on the board, Jones v. City of Los Angeles, 9th Circuit, 444 F.3 D. 1118. Reinforced the principle that municipalities cannot punish individuals for the involuntary act of being homeless when they lack alternatives. This is not just a matter of discretion, Your Honor. It is settled law. He paused not for effect, but for air. For years, he had been spoken over, stepped around, looked through. Not today. Today, the room had to listen. And they were. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, eyes fixed on James. Kearns shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand reached for the docket again, but it lingered in midair. James turned a page. If this court proceeds with prosecution under 14.07.3b, he said, it does so in direct conflict with precedent from both the U.S. Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I am prepared to submit relevant case law, a municipal shelter audit, and photographic evidence of no vacancy notices posted at Newbridge shelters the night of my citation. He let the words hang. And hang. The judge glanced at the bailiff. Then at the gallery. Then back at James, this man in a coat patched at the elbow whose words carried the weight of 3 federal rulings and constitutional clarity. Kearns's voice, when it finally returned, was quieter than before. Where, he said carefully, did you learn all this? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was real. Not dismissive. Not sarcastic. Just disoriented. Like a man waking up in someone else's dream. James didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply met the judge's eyes. From the same place you did, he said. And then slowly, almost ceremoniously, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew the folded document. He placed it on the lectern, but didn't open it. Not yet. Let the question hang in the air. Who is this man really? And when the truth came, it wouldn't come loud. It would come like a verdict. For a long moment, no one in the courtroom moved. The air, once filled with murmurs and laughter, had become something heavier, charged, almost reverent. Like the moment before a storm when wind vanishes and sky holds its breath. James T. Rowland stood alone behind the lectern, his posture composed, his hands still resting on either side of the document he had just retrieved from his coat pocket. The same coat they had laughed at. The same coat they had dismissed. Now, that pocket held something they weren't expecting. The paper was thick, not new, but preserved, its edges soft with time, its center folded sharply from years of careful keeping. It was the kind of fold that spoke not of neglect, but of reverence. A document carried not for display, but for defense. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift the page high or brandish it like a weapon. Instead, he slid it forward across the lectern, slow, precise, with the silence of a man who understood the weight of what he was revealing. My name is James Timothy Rowland, he said, his voice low, steady. Graduate of Harvard Law School, class of 2001. Formerly admitted to the New York State Bar. License status currently inactive under the hardship clause. Gasps. Soft, real? Like breath-catching in collective throats. The courtroom stirred as though waking from a dream they didn't know they'd entered. The woman in the third row, the one who had smirked earlier, blinked rapidly. Her face slackened. A man in a tailored suit leaned forward so abruptly his briefcase toppled to the floor with a soft thud. Even the bailiff, stationed near the bench like a statue, shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Judge Kearns didn't speak. His expression didn't contort, not yet. But the change had begun. That little upturn of arrogance at the corners of his mouth gone. That look of amused superiority in his eyes fading. He looked down at the document as if it might burn him. His fingers, gripping the armrests of the bench, whitened just slightly. "You're a lawyer?" he asked finally, the words dry in his mouth. "I am," James answered. "Though I haven't practiced formally in several years. My license remains in good standing, if inactive. I can provide verification from the New York bar if the court requires it." The clerk had stopped typing. The pen in the juror's hand fell to the floor and rolled under the bench. James did not move to retrieve it. He wasn't here to gather what they dropped. Not anymore. Judge Kearns leaned forward slowly, squinting at the document as if proximity might change its meaning. "Why didn't you say that at the beginning?" he asked, his voice less a demand and more uncertain. James met his gaze, calm as ever. "Because it wouldn't have changed what you saw when I walked in." The judge flinched barely, but it was there. A flicker. A crack in the stone. James continued, his voice quiet but resonant. "I didn't come here to be respected because of a degree. I came here to be treated with dignity regardless of one. Silence. Not the kind that waits for a punchline, the kind that waits for judgment." And this time, James was not the one being judged. The roles had shifted. Judge Kearns looked away. Not at the gallery. Not at the bailiff. Just away, toward the corner of the courtroom where the wall met the floor, as though searching for an answer that wasn't on the bench in front of him. James stood still. He let the moment stretch, unbroken. Because some truths didn't need elaboration. They needed silence to echo in. And this one did. James slid the diploma back toward himself, but did not fold it yet. He left it there, visible. Undeniable. Let them see it. Let them sit with it. He turned his eyes toward the judge once more. "I'm prepared to proceed with my argument," he said simply. Kearns didn't respond. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. Whatever smugness had carried him through the last 30 minutes was gone, collapsed under the quiet weight of one man's patience and precision. Then, from the back row, someone whispered, not loud enough to disrupt the court, but just loud enough to be heard. "Harvard." Another voice, he said Harvard Law. The murmurs grew, not in mockery this time, but in disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes when the script people thought they knew burns in their hands. The judge finally exhaled and reached for his water glass. His hand trembled just slightly. And still, James waited. He wasn't asking for recognition. He was waiting to see if the court, now stripped of its assumptions, could finally hear the case. Not the man. The law. Then he tilted his head, not challengingly, but calmly, and said the words that landed like a choice laid gently between two futures. "Shall I continue, Your Honor?" The courtroom was suspended in a moment so dense it felt like no one dared to breathe. Gone was the laughter. Gone was the dismissive snickering, the barely concealed whispers. In their place, stillness, stunned and watching. James T. Rowland remained standing at the lectern, same posture, same presence, but now the weight of the room had tilted. The center of gravity no longer sat behind the judge's bench. It was here, with him. The diploma lay on the wood before him, its folded form seeming to radiate more power than any shouted protest ever could. The paper itself hadn't changed, it was still old, creased, slightly yellowed around the edges. But it had become something else in their eyes. Proof. Defiance wrapped in documentation. James glanced down at it, then back up to Judge Kearns, not with aggression, not with superiority, but with unwavering clarity. "If the court requires it," he said, quiet and resolute, "I will submit my credentials into evidence." The words weren't a challenge. They weren't a plea. They were an offering. And somehow, that made them all the more powerful. The judge didn't speak. He opened his mouth once, stopped, swallowed, adjusted his glasses with a hand that trembled just slightly, a tremor not from age, but from recognition. The recognition that he had been seen. Not the homeless man with the frayed coat, but the man who had watched the room, gauged it, and chosen the precise moment to reveal what he was made of. Not to boast, to remind them of what they had forgotten. That dignity doesn't require permission. And that power doesn't always shout. James could feel it, the shift in the courtroom's gaze. It wasn't just stunned anymore. It was searching. The same eyes that had dismissed him now studied him differently. There was tension, yes, but woven into it was the fragile thread of something new. Respect. Not the kind you're born into. Not the kind granted with robes or gavels. But the kind carved out of restraint, knowledge, and unshakable presence. Kearns finally leaned back, his chair groaning under the movement as though resisting the idea of yielding. His face had lost its color. The practiced air of control had unraveled at the edges. And still, he said nothing. James could feel the space around him opening, not as invitation but as acknowledgement. "I came here today," he said, tone unchanging, "not to be seen as exceptional, but to be seen as human." No one moved. Not even the court reporter, who had momentarily stopped typing altogether. "And I stood," he continued, "because I knew sitting would suggest I was ready to be dismissed before I was heard." Judge Kearns gripped the armrests again. His knuckles were white. 1,000 comebacks flickered behind his eyes, legalese, deflections, rehearsed authority. But none of them left his mouth. James let the silence work. He had learned through years of being spoken over that silence could sometimes speak loudest. That there's power in not demanding anything, only offering a truth and waiting to see who can carry it. The judge finally looked at the document again. Not like a threat. Not like a relic. But like evidence of something not written in law but felt in the room. He cleared his throat. "Tried again. Mr. Rowland." "Ayo." But the sentence fell apart. James held his gaze. Not to challenge. To meet him man to man. No robes. No titles. Just two people separated not by education or ability but by perception. And that perception was unraveling. "I'm prepared to continue with my defense," James said, voice calm as ever. "Or, should the court prefer, I can submit a motion for immediate dismissal based on constitutional grounds." The judge stared at him. And for the first time since James had entered the room, the power dynamic did not lie with the man behind the bench. It lay with the man in the coat. The man they had laughed at. The man who stood and spoke and waited. And in his waiting, in his patience, had reminded them all what justice should feel like. A pause. Deep. Heavy. Then from the gallery, somewhere near the back, a single sound. A slow, soft clap. It stopped almost immediately, awkward and nervous, but it had been real. A spark. A break in the facade. The judge closed the file on his desk. His hands were trembling more now. He didn't reach for the gavel. He didn't make a ruling. Because he couldn't, not yet. Not when he didn't even know where he stood anymore. James said nothing more. He waited, letting the silence ask the question he no longer needed to voice. What happens when the court realizes it was the one on trial all along?